Today I'm going to introduce you, enormous group, to the idea of market power, monopoly. And we'll start by talking about what monopoly is and when does it arise. We'll talk about natural versus unnatural monopoly. We'll then turn to monopoly pricing and the quantity reduction, as well as Lerner's markup rule, and some of the subtleties of pricing. And we'll talk about an empirical application to pricing on eBay, and we'll use that to talk about the notion of ironing. I don't know if you guys have seen that before. We'll then turn to the welfare side of monopoly, to the monopoly distortion and incidence, and contrast incidence under perfect competition, contrast monopoly incidence to incidence under perfect competition. We'll talk about the pass-through rate under monopoly and how that's related to demand curvature, and some applications of incidence logic to taxation of foreign trade and the creation of new markets. Okay, so monopoly by its nature sort of sounds like this is the only company in the world, right? But the basic mechanisms we're going to be talking about apply to, in some sense, any non-price-taking firm. And this includes any time a company can affect the purchase price of its good. And it will happen more or less severely depending on the size of the monopoly's incentive, or the firm's incentive, to change prices rather than to just choose its actions taking prices as good. So a natural question is, when should we use monopoly models versus oligopoly models or other models that include market power? And is Il-Myung Huang here? No? Does anyone else want to give their opinion on when they think monopoly models are the right way to think about something versus a oligopoly model?
It just depends on market share.
Maybe. Well, the question is, in what market? I mean, every firm has, like any firm that you call monopoly has something that competes with them, right? And any firm that is competitive probably has some price-taking power. Yeah.
So the extent to which it is if it's really difficult to substitute for the good that the firm is dealing with, then you might want to treat it as monopoly.
Well, I think that the problem to me with that is that that'll generate a lot of pricing power, but at some point that firm will be substitutable, especially at high enough prices for other goods. And then the question is, why not include other firms that are producing its goods? I mean, if it's completely demand dependent, maybe, but I don't know of any product that's like that. So I think that the main reason I see for using monopoly models is that they're focused on just that one firm. That doesn't mean there aren't other substitutes, but you sort of bracket all those substitutes as being some outside good, right? And that allows you to focus, if you're only interested in sort of the direct effects of some intervention on that firm, on the prices of those firms, it doesn't really matter that much what goes on with other firms, right? Another thing that monopoly models ignore is the welfare effects through other firms. So we talked about how firms changing their prices can have pecuniary or non-pecuniary externalities on other firms, and those are just ignored in this analysis, or they're treated as pecuniary externalities that we don't care about, right? A monopoly model, therefore, cannot be used to think about the effects of changing the structure of an industry, like two firms merging or having a different relationship with one another, because other firms are ignored, right? So it's sort of an analysis that focuses on the behavior of a single firm, often as an input to analysis that thinks about a broader competitive environment. Yeah, James?
Can you remind us again, when we say pecuniary externalities here, are we talking about just the effects on other firms?
Effects of changes in prices of other firms, but not changes in their quantities. Okay, so what causes firms to have market power? What causes them to be able to affect the prices they face? Well, there are two sources, basically. One is what are called unnatural, and the other which is called natural monopoly. So the most classic sources of unnatural monopoly are intellectual property. These are either private trade secrets or government protection. This is going to be the focus of Tuesday's lecture, except not this coming Tuesday. Sorry, that's going to be the focus of lecture 12. Lobbying and protection are another source, right? And these can be very harmful both from a dynamic and a static perspective. And so we try to stop this sort of source of monopoly by restrictions on lobbying. Private or illegal violence, such as the mafia. The mafia maintains monopolies on drugs, on gambling in some areas, by basically forcing other competitors out of business. And law enforcement can try to deal with that, except that law enforcement doesn't want the industry to exist at all. And so it's often easy to enforce monopoly in those areas because you can sort of beat up your opponents because you don't care about going to jail because you're going to go to jail for doing the industry anyway, right? They can also come from talent or first, to the market advantages in the short term. And this may resolve itself in the long term or not, depending, as we were talking on, about how much it's talent or just a short-term advantage that lets you be ahead. But monopoly can persist for a while, even if it is just time that lets things get ahead. And in these cases, sometimes transparency or reducing bureaucracy can help aid people to enter in order to compete. Okay, things are trickier when monopoly is what's called natural or inevitable. And Daiichi's not here, but does anyone else want to say what are some examples of things that make monopoly natural? Like what does it mean for monopoly to be natural? Yeah, Jim?
So like if you return to scale, if you have diminishing marginal cost, then naturally you go outside.
Yeah, so a simple sufficient condition is what Jim said, which is that there's economies of scale through the full range of production. Then a larger firm is always going to be more efficient than any smaller firm, and so it never makes sense to have more than one firm. And this is the most natural case for a natural monopoly, but it's not actually required in order to have natural monopoly. So all that's required is what's called subadditivity. What's subadditivity? It means that any two operations would be more efficient when they're combined. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you have economies of scale all the way through. So you could think of an example where your cost curve looks like this. If demand is here, you're actually in a part where the returns to scale are increasing. But anytime you split this into two firms, they're going to be more costly than if you combine them, right? Because they always walk back up to the point where there's decreasing returns to scale. Okay. The crucial question is, what are the economies of scale relative to the size of the market currently, right? Obviously, if this market got big enough, if we were way out there, then there would no longer be subadditivity, right? Okay. So, Carl, what are some examples of things that people usually think are natural monopolies?
Usually things, networks, like roads and electrical utilities.
Yeah. Yeah, those are all good examples. Social networks are another example because of the network effects, absent the ability to easily interconnect between them. Another example of this is monitoring income. So in order to monitor what income different people in the economy are earning, it's very useful to monitor what income other people in the economy are earning. So you can sort of check one thing against the other. And that's one reason why the government supplies all public goods, not just there are sort of different government groups supplying different government goods, public goods. Because to supply public goods, it's very useful to monitor people's income as you get a sense for how much they should be paying for that. And so it can be very efficient for the government to control all things where you're doing extensive income-based price discrimination. Another example is public transportation in many settings. It has economies of scale because you have to create a whole network that connects all the different areas like Carl was saying. Okay, So the basic idea of monopoly is that monopoly has an incentive to reduce quantity in order to raise the price of a good. And the reason is that in order to sell more goods, they have to lower their price, not just on the next unit of the good they want to sell, but on all the inframarginal units of the good as well. And that creates a trade-off between selling more and charging a higher price. So to see that, note that the monopoly's profits depend on quantity and are price times quantity minus cost. But that's not going to lead them to want to set price equal to marginal cost. Instead, they're going to want to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And is Dan here? Yeah, Dan. What is the formula for marginal revenue?
That's just the derivative of price times quantity.
Yeah, and so what's that?
So that's just going to be the derivative of the price slope.
Yeah.
Plus the price times quantity.
Well, it's the price plus the price slope times quantity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's very similar to what you said, just slightly reversed. So the marginal revenue is equal to price plus price prime times quantity. So this first term, if that was set equal to marginal cost, you would just be acting like a competitive firm. So this first term is sort of the non-pecuniary effect. This is like you changing your quantity, taking the price as fixed. The second is sort of like taking one side of a pecuniary externality, right? Because you're looking at the change in price times your quantity. This is how much you're getting and taking away from the consumer through a pecuniary effect, right? Okay, so the distortion, this second term, which is called market power or the Cournot distortion or marginal surplus, is proportional to the number of units you sell, Q. So if you're a small part of an industry, then you're going to have a small impact, right? You don't care that much about that. And the amount that you move price when you change your quantity. If, again, if you don't affect prices very much, if you're small, or if your industry's impact is small, then your distortion will be small. So sort of the bigger that you are, in some sense, and we'll quantify that in terms of elasticity soon, the more that you want to reduce your quantity in order to raise your price. So let me provide some graphical examples of marginal revenue and how we solve for these things. Okay, so here's a linear demand curve. And imagine that the marginal cost were just wherever the horizontal axis happens to be in these pictures. So here's the linear demand, and here's its marginal revenue curve. Notice two things about this. First, it's twice as steep as the demand. And second, it intersects at a price which is exactly halfway up the demand curve. Right? So that's a general property of linear demands. And the way you solve this, of course, is that you take the intersection between marginal revenue and marginal cost. You take a line up to the demand curve and over to price. Okay. This here is a constant elasticity demand curve. Now, the relationship between the marginal revenue and demand there is very different than in the case of the linear demand, right? Because actually, rather than getting further apart as you go down, they're actually getting closer together as you come down, right? And so these have a very different shape in relationship to one another, and we'll see why that matters later. This is an exponential demand curve here, and here's its marginal revenue curve. These are a constant distance apart from each other, all the way down. And with a concave demand curve, like here, the marginal revenue curve